Hi, I'm Aaron Betsky. I'm the author of 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright and a critic of all great architecture. And you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Eero Saarinen, who died in 1961, is now one of the most well-known and respected modernist architects in history. He's famous for the St. Louis Arch, the TWA Terminal at JFK, Dulles Airport outside of D.C., and many other innovative projects. More than just about any other architect, his work signaled an optimistic future, a sweeping, beautiful, curvy future that was going to require, as the song would say decades later, shades. But Saarinen wasn't always so well known, and for about 8 years before his death, there was one incredibly smart and talented woman who built and managed Saarinen's reputation, helping him become the megastar he is today. We're joined today by author Eva Hagberg with the new book, When Eero Met His Match, Aline Louchheim Saarinen and the Making of an Architect. And later, thanks to a somewhat miraculous discovery, we chat with Ruth Clements Pudists. She was Eero Saarinen's secretary, and even though she's now in her 90s, she possesses a memory sharper than any of us. Ruth was there during the growth of the Saarinen practice and made arrangements with Aline when he died. And now, your host, the guy who gets his best research done over cocktails and past appetizers, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. All those spy novels set at embassy cocktail parties and thrilling locations, there's really nothing like vodka and salmon and goat cheese to get people talking, particularly in a nice setting. I was at an AIA conference in Chicago, their first in-person event since 2019, munching on said salmon at one of their well-orchestrated and COVID-safe outdoor parties. One of the architects I met there said some really nice things about the podcast. And then out of the blue, when we were talking about some of our shows on Neutra, Rudolph, Elwood, and Saarinen, he said, "You know Saarinen's secretary is still alive, right?" "Really? Okay. Do you know her name?" "Yes," he said, and just like that, very rapid texting got our ace modernist researcher, Catherine, hot on the trail. And when Catherine wants to find something, she finds it. Soon she located our guest, and it wasn't easy. Ruth Clements Pudists, now in her 90s, was the secretary to Eero Saarinen during those important years with Aline that Eva Hagberg writes about. Ruth was there for just about all of it, as she was when Saarinen died. What's more, after the Saarinen firm moved to Connecticut from Michigan, she stayed in Michigan and started working for Minoru Yamasaki, architect of the World Trade Center, and she was there for that too. Guests just don't get any better than this. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll. In a story that we are largely making up, modernist realtor Angela Roll worked her way through college, dancing like no one's watching to Mambo No. 5 and brilliantly house-flipping Neutra, sometimes simultaneously. At 22, following a celebrity-filled party at a famous hillside L.A. modernist house involving diving off the roof into the pool, absolute Le Mans, and a new use for WD-40, Angela was recruited to the architecture school, where after years of sleep-deprived design studios, she's now a modernist real estate agent with specialized training, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to saving a completely doomed mid-century house from destruction. That last one is true. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Eva Hagberg is an adjunct assistant professor and writer based in Brooklyn, New York. She holds a BA in architecture from Princeton, as well as a master's and PhD from Berkeley. Her focus is on the role of publicity in gaining architectural success. She is an architectural critic, an essayist, and a studio director for Loback Designs. She's the author of Dark Nostalgia, Nature Framed, How to Be Loved, a memoir of life-saving friendship, and the forthcoming When Eero Met His Match, Aline Louchheim Saarinen and the Making of an Architect. Here's George's interview in New York City with Eva Hagberg.
I met Eva 12 years ago when she flew down to Raleigh-Durham, where I live. She was writing for Wallpaper magazine at the time, and she wanted to interview me for the beginning of this project, which at that time was called Triangle Modernist Houses. That was a long time ago, Eva.
That was a very long time ago.
And our ACE research department, in giving me background about you, you have lived many lifetimes since then. It's a mini-series.
Yep. I think it's a number of mini-series. We got the tragedy, we have the prestige drama, we have the sitcom, we have the horror movie. We have a couple of horror movies. We got it all.
I mean, you have been a major publicist. Mm-hmm. You got married. Mm-hmm. You were involved in a harassment case. Mm-hmm. You got 1, maybe 2 degrees in there.
Yeah, 2 since I saw you last.
Yeah. And now you've got this great new book coming out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is, I do want to see the miniseries. Who's going to play you? Have you picked that yet?
This is a question for my friends, not for me. I think, Justin Theroux or Emily Blunt would both do a great job playing me.
Oh, wouldn't that be great?
Wouldn't that be amazing? You just have them both.
That would be great.
Yep.
Well, let's start with Saarinen and your book.
Yeah.
I've always heard the story that Eero and Aline had an interview scheduled, and by the end of the afternoon, they were in bed together, and it was off to the races. Mm-hmm. Is that true?
That is true. That is true. So let me just paint the picture for you a little bit. So the year is 1953. Aline Saarinen is this very hotshot New York Times art and architecture reporter. And she gets this assignment really by chance. It was actually given to somebody else at first, and then that person, I think he probably recommended her because he was her teacher at Vassar. So Aline gets this assignment. She's written once about Eero in 1948. She's written about the Arch competition. And she flies to Bloomfield Hills, and there is a moment that she describes in a letter later where they're driving in the car, and they turn the corner, and she describes them turning the corner physically and emotionally. And I think there was some sort of hand grab. There was some kind of, meet cute moment where perhaps they both reached for the gear shift at the same time. And within a couple hours, they had crossed a threshold, as she said. So, yes.
Such an eloquent term.
I know. So an early draft of the book was basically just lurid pornography, which was based on their letters, which are, I have no judgment. I thought it was great, but my advisor, Margaretta Lovell, phenomenal Americanist and art historian, would just put 3 little exclamation points next to certain sections of my dissertation and be like, do we really need this? And I was like, yes, we do not. Okay.
So this was a dissertation before it was a book?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And where were you in school doing all that?
I was at UC Berkeley.
Okay. Great school.
Great school. Yeah.
Saarinen and Aline were quite a pair until his untimely death.
Yes.
What, about 8 years, roughly?
Yeah, so they got together in 1953, they got married in 1954, and then he died in 61.
Okay.
So
of a brain hemorrhage.
Of a brain tumor.
Brain
and then
tumor.
she died of a brain tumor 10 years later.
10 years later,
So something was in the water, as they say.
Now, tell us about Aline, because she's really fascinating.
So Aline Saarinen, fascinating character, born in 1914 to a family of sort of intellectuals. She went to the Fieldston School. She went to Vassar. She studied with John McAndrew, who was his famous art historian. She married Joseph Louchheim, who I believe was a welfare administrator, had 2 sons, divorced Joseph Louchheim, and then started writing for the New York Times. And she had this extraordinary ability to your point about making architecture accessible. She was able to write about complicated modernist architectural ideas in a way that was lively and spirited and accessible and descriptive. I read most of her pieces that she'd written for the Times. She really contextualized everything. I mean, she was really deeply interested in architecture. She was very much part of this sort of social milieu in New York in the 1940s and 1950s. In many letters to Saarinen, she does a lot of name dropping. So she says, I was, at Philip Johnson's house, and Nicholas Pevsner was there. And she was engaged to Edgar Kaufman Jr., the department store magnate, for a while. So she really was sort of a woman about town. So she was this sort of lively, vibrant, very independent woman. There's a lot of pictures of her doing amazing things. Like one of my favorite ones, she's holding a huge snake sort of just blithely wrapped around her neck. She was very tough, very independent, very smart, and then just fell head over heels in love with this Finnish-American architect who lived, 2,000 miles away and was married and had 2 children and had a thriving practice. And she made him an offer that he could not refuse.
And what was that?
The offer was to make him famous.
Wow. That's quite an offer.
Yeah. Yeah. So she's in New York. She's kind of living it up. She's having a great time. And Saarinen is married to this sort of brilliant but described as difficult sculptor, Lillian Swan. And he had these huge ambitions. He really wanted to be dean at Yale. And he wrote these letters to his psychiatrist, which are extraordinary. And he says in them, I really want to be a dean at Yale. I have high ambitions for myself. I don't know if Lily is the right woman for me. So he was kind of on the market.
Is that how therapy did in those days? You wrote your therapist?
You just wrote, 7-page handwritten letters. I mean, thank God for us historians that's how my therapy is just, private and undocumented. So apologies to my future biographers. So he was kind of primed, and he was actually considering a number of candidates. So
Note to self, call Blue Cross.
Exactly. So one candidate was the Swedish textile designer Astrid Sampe. He thought, maybe she could really help me. And then, we don't know what their conversations were, but the copious letters that Aline and Eero wrote to each other right after they met during their courtship indicate that there was some ongoing conversation about his ambitions. And she kept saying, I think I could really help you. I can offer these things. She even went so far as to say, I'm applying for a job. Here are the candidate's qualifications. And it's sort of half professional and then half very flirty. And she even sent him, this is explosive if anybody's a journalist, she sent him a draft of the New York Times profile asking for his feedback and comments before she submitted it.
Wow.
And so she let him edit it. So she was really saying, I have this platform, I'm in New York, I know all these people, so if you really want to make something of yourself, I can really help you. Here's the role that I can occupy. There's many central arguments of my book, but one of them is that she really was the first person in architecture to professionalize this role of publicist, and she did it under cover of being sort of a helpful wife. I mean, She was like, I'm just your helpmeet, I can do this for you, but she very systematically, precisely, intelligently, carefully kind of codified the set of practices that are now basically standard. So, I say most architects who have any renown have a publicist, which historians just don't know.
And back in that time, architects were very much more, cradled in their own sanctimoniousness. I mean, they didn't advertise at all.
They weren't allowed to advertise.
Right.
I mean, crucially, right? So the AIA had a bar against advertising, and they just said, you can't advertise yourself. You can't advertise your services. You can't promote yourself. Architecture was very much a gentleman's profession. It was basically, if you were already rich, you could kind of do it for fun.
Law was the same way.
Really?
Yeah. You couldn't advertise as an attorney.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Because it was seen to be, beneath them.
Yes.
With the hoi polloi.
Exactly. And I think Aline really played up, and I did too when I was working as a publicist, she really played up the sort of refined approach that she was going to take. So she was like, listen, nobody will know that I'm really here, but suddenly you'll be published. And that was exactly the service that I offered, 60 years later.
So you work with a number of well-known architects like Rick Joy. Mm-hmm. And how did that start for you?
It started really randomly. So I was in grad school. I was researching this project about the Saarinens, and I was trying to make a little money on the side. I'd had experience writing website copy for architects. So I met this architecture firm through a photographer named Garcia Tamgidi. They're great. They do really beautiful, careful, minimalist work. And we had a phone call. They said, would you rewrite our website? I said, sure. And then I went in for a meeting and they said, well, we actually need somebody to do sort of like a marketing and PR role. Is that something that you'd be interested in? And I very quickly did the math and realized that I couldn't do marketing, but that I'd been an architecture journalist for 10 years by that point, and I was pretty sure I could sort of reverse engineer a career as a publicist. I would just do to people what people had done to me.
Right. The golden rule of publicity.
Exactly. So I just remembered, okay, how did all these publicists treat me? What did they do? What were the rules? How did I learn how to be a freelancer? So I said, sure, I could do this, and wrote up a little proposal that basically listed all the famous friends that I had. As, I know people at this publication. And they said, great, how do you want to charge? And I just sort of made up a number and I said that I worked on retainer, and they were happy with my work. And then they referred me to some friends of theirs, and then I got referred again. And then I realized at a certain point that there's sort of a couple schools of publicity. And one is that you want everybody to know that you're a publicist. And so there's a lot of firms that they list their clients and they sort of celebrate the press that they got. And I think that's a very reasonable approach. I want it to be a little bit more secret. And so I sort of developed this. So I purposely cultivated a little bit of reticence and mystique around myself. So I said, well, I only take, referrals from current clients, and I don't ever say that I work with you. I'll never publicly indicate that I work with you. I ask that you do the same. I really work sort of behind the scenes, and that I think worked really well, right? People want something that they can't easily have.
Right.
People like not being sold to. I was talking to a former client, and she said, one of your things is that you don't even realize that you're being sold to, and suddenly, we've signed over like half of our revenue. And I like to think that that's accurate. I don't know if it is. But I sort of just got very good at selling my services, essentially. And then I hired 2 people to help me because I had so many clients that I couldn't keep up on my own. And it became this sort of very thriving, I think at some point we had 10 or 11 clients.
That's a big PR firm.
Big PR firm. Yeah. Just me with my little email address in my brain.
Yeah. And then what happened with this firm? Where did it go?
So I was in the Bay Area, and as you said, I got married, and my marriage was starting to be a little weird, and I wanted it to be better. So in the grand tradition of people in denial, I thought if we moved to New York, everything would get better. So I dragged my then husband across the country, moved to New York, and pretty shortly thereafter, I realized that where we had been living was not the problem. So I filed for divorce and started this very, very convoluted process. And the divorce...
Of divorce or
of
PR?
Divorce.
Okay.
So my divorce was it was ridiculous. It was very complicated. And I had been the sole earner, and I had been making a lot of money at this PR firm. And so I was kind of on the hook for what I thought was an extraordinary amount of spousal support. So that's happening in the background, right? So that's sort of the emotional thing. And then I think I just had too many clients. And I hadn't really set up any systems or any structures. And when I had sold myself so effectively, I had basically sold people that I would kind of do anything that they needed. And that was really effective in getting people to sign contracts. But then I had to actually deliver. And so I started feeling very... I'm going to say sort of overburdened by people's drives, by people's desires. People wanted more than I was giving them. I would get these publications that I thought were amazing. I would get people into the New York Times. I would get people into wallpaper. And it sort of felt like it was never enough. And I think part of that was what I had set up. I mean, I just hadn't set expectations well. I'm like trying to get divorced, and I'm like on the hook for a lot of money, and I'm starting to feel like my clients want more from me. Then I generally am starting to feel like a lot of people want a lot of things from me. I sort of have my ex-husband's lawyer, siphoning off my spirit. I have clients sort of siphoning off my spirit. At some point...
You're a giant gas tank being siphoned.
Exactly. And, it's on me that I was like, sure, take it. One of my employees quit very harmoniously, very nicely. But so she quit, and then so I had to do a lot more work. And at some point, I hired somebody else just to make me do my work. So I said, I'm going to pay you like $60,000 to just email me and make me do my work. And
A minder, really.
Basically.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is getting very complicated. Like, I'm just putting more and more sort of structures on things, and I just don't want to do this. I burned out. What happened is I just burned out. And I'd finished my dissertation. I'd published a memoir. I had these 10 clients. I was trying to get divorced, which was so much harder than I thought it was going to be. I really thought it was...
Everybody discovers that, really.
Everybody discovers that.
Yeah.
I remember being like, this is going to hurt for a couple of weeks, but I'll be relieved. And I was just on the floor for pretty much a year. And I asked my divorce attorney, I was like, can I quit? I can't do this anymore. And his advice was like, the court will not look kindly upon you losing your income. So then I was not only unhappy with my work, but suddenly I was being forced, it felt like, to keep doing it, which just for me felt intolerable. So I just thought there's no way out. I'm trapped in this profession. I don't enjoy it anymore. And then COVID happened. And so all of my clients called me within a week. And they said, we have to put your contract on hold. And I was like, if you terminated my contract,
I wouldn't be unhappy,
that
right?
would not be the worst thing. And so they all wrote me letters and they terminated their contracts. And I sent those letters to my divorce attorney and I was able to stop working. And I had enough, kind of saved up that I just was like, okay, I'm just not going to do PR anymore. I started writing a novel about... Oh, no, I'd started writing the novel before the pandemic because the novel was about a pandemic. And I started it in I think August 2019 or something. I was like, what if there was a global pandemic? So I just decided to finish that novel. I changed the ending. The original ending had been everybody dies. What an interesting thought experiment. So I radically changed that. And so I just spent a year sort of writing a novel. And
in your novel... Are there a bunch of deniers that say it doesn't exist? Did you include that feature?
I did not include that feature. My novel ended up being much more about the internet and teens and influencers. So, the pandemic part of the novel really sort of shrank down into a tiny plot vehicle.
It's the background.
Exactly.
Right.
It's just the thing that gets the people to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And then... I think I sort of basically just took about a year off. And then recently, a couple of my clients contacted me and I decided that I would be willing to do it again. So I now have 3 clients. It's just me. I have no employees. I'm only working with people that I really, really like. And I just had learned so much about having better boundaries. And, I write about this in the book. I think part of why my boundaries got so goofy is that the only professional model that I had was Aline. And so, an original...
Not known for her boundaries.
Not known for her boundaries. I did not sleep with any of my clients. I want to be clear. There was no hand-holding. There was no,
no gear shift around the corner.
There was no gear shift around the corner. But I did sort of put myself in this role. I would sort of reassure them. I would listen to their anxieties. I would try to soothe them.
Right.
I would do a lot of...
You have to as a PR person. That's part of the job.
Exactly. But I think that, having her... a person who was married to her client as my only model did not really show me very clear boundaries. And so I sort of learned this time, don't act like I'm married to my clients. You know, I do my best. I set better expectations. I don't respond to emails within 10 minutes, which used to be really important to me. So I learned a lot, but I have a brain that likes to do new things all the time. And running this company was really fun when I didn't know how to do it. Right? Because it was really exciting to figure out, how do I do payroll? How do I pitch a story? How do I place a story? How do I share images? How do I manage a photo shoot? How do I create it? It was all really new. And then as soon as I knew how to do it, my brain was like, okay, what's next? So.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
And you have a new boyfriend now.
I have a new boyfriend. Yeah.
Which is great.
Totally great. And I'm his publicist. So I actually have not learned my lesson at all.
Wait a second. What happened to
Forget everything I just said about boundaries. So he's an industrial designer, incredibly talented. And on our first vacation, we ended up sort of driving around a car park. And
oh my God, this is Saarinen.
It's ridiculous.
All over
again. We're driving around a car park, holding hands over the gear shift. And he had said, he was like, I feel like the one thing that's been missing in my career is somebody to really sort of handle, media and publicity for me. And I had quit PR at that point, and I was sort of like, okay, Eva, like this is a moment, right? Like what you do now is going to either be amazing or it's going to be terrible. And he kept driving around and around, and we talked, and I was like, well, that's actually, that's what I do. I'm really good at that. And we had a very serious conversation that was like, okay, well, what could go wrong? Not rhetorically what could go wrong, but what could go wrong?
Actually go wrong.
And I remembered that. So you see the trajectory of Aline and Eero's relationship, right? So the 1953, 54, they're so in love. She's just like, oh, I love you, so I will do anything for you. By 1958, she's writing him memos that say, this is your letter to answer. Please answer it. Dear Eero, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what you want me to do.
Right.
It's clear that some sort of tension
arises. Get with the program here.
Exactly.
Kind of notes.
And there's sort of this my last chapter is called I'm Really Not Interested in That Project, because somebody asked her to write a book about him. And she said, I would actually like to, the way she put it is confine my writing to work outside the office. I think she really wanted to write her own books, have her own ideas. And so I told this to Paul. I said, listen, one of the biggest issues was that Aline Saarinen kind of stopped doing her own work. So if we're going to work together, I need to always have time for my own work. I need to have space to write the books that I want to write, to write the articles that I want to write. And we agreed together that even if we become, incredibly financially successful and we're gazillionaires, but our relationship and my creative life suffer, then we will always prioritize our relationship and our creative life. And so we sort of started setting up these ideas. We had other ideas. We were like, oh, we should not talk about work after 6, and actually all of that doesn't work for us. I mean, we talk about work at 1 a.m. We talk about work on a Sunday afternoon.
Of course you do.
Of course, right?
Nobody follows those rules, really.
Exactly. Nobody does.
No, yeah.
But it's been really fun so far. And, he had a really good sales quarter last quarter, so which I take 100% credit for.
Of course. Now, Eero and Aline had a great run there until his death. And this was kind of at the height of his popularity in 1961. He was working on Dulles Airport at the time.
I think so. And the TWA Terminal is
the famous terminal at JFK. Mm-hmm. He was the airport king.
Yep.
And he had office complexes that he was working on around the country. And then, Aline, at what point did she go to television?
That is after he dies.
Okay.
So he dies very suddenly. I mean, they have 2 weeks notice. He goes to the doctor. He doesn't feel good. The doctor says you have a brain tumor. I think they consider operating. They don't operate, and he dies. I mean, it's just overnight. And this was in the middle of Aline trying to sort of expand her interests. So he dies, and she just immediately puts all of her effort into making sure that The Office can finish TWA and publishing it. And
this is with Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo?
Yep. And Joe Lacey, I think, was still there. So she really kind of put in a couple more years, and then, my research stops there. So I believe that Kathleen McGuigan is writing a biography of Aline that I think focuses a lot on her post-Eero life. But she goes to TV, she becomes this very influential American cultural figure, contributes a lot, and then also dies.
I remember seeing her growing up on television.
Really?
Because she had that unusual name, right?
Yep.
And she was one of the very few women reporters.
Yeah.
That were on the air at all. Mm-hmm. I mean, most of them were on what were called women's shows,
right? Which
aired like at 8 a.m, right? And were about cooking and decorating and things like that. But she was a frontline reporter, for news and things that were going on.
What did you think of her when you saw her?
She was great. I mean, she had a wonderful presence on television. Mm-hmm. And of course, I didn't know anything about architecture at the time. I was like 7,
right?
So.
Do you think it helped spark your later interest?
Not at all. No.
Great.
I didn't really even discover architecture until I was in my 40s.
Okay.
My dad was an architect, but I didn't want anything to do with it growing up. It was like that thing my dad did.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how kids are about their parents' jobs.
Oh, yeah. My parents are all philosophers, and I'm like, what? You write books?
You come from a family of philosophers,
I
really?
do. I have many parents, and they are all philosophy professors, although my stepmother is an art historian. But
okay. Is she like the black sheep of the family?
As the art historian. There's no, everybody gets along great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you talk a lot of Kierkegaard around the dining room table?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, so people thought that my dinner table conversations must have been amazing growing up, but it was mostly...
German philosophy, maybe?
No, it was just complaining about other people's course reductions and, I can't believe this person got a sabbatical and this person, it was just like departmental politics.
Yeah.
So that's what I grew up with, and of course, existential dread, because when I was 4, my parents were like, well, how do you know you exist? And I was like, because I know I do. And they were like, well... And since then, I've been like, am I real?
Yeah.
I don't
Did
know.
you go to your Barbie and go, Barbie, do I exist?
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Yeah.
What can we learn from Aline in terms of architecture and PR? What were some of the things that she did that you've also done that can help people out there who either want to get into PR or have a firm that they want to get someone?
So one of the things that she was most instrumental in working out, and this was sort of a historical context, was the idea of the exclusive. So at the beginning of her work as a publicist, basically the practice was you sent your projects to all the magazines and then it appeared in many magazines and that was fine. To contemporary journalists and publicists, this is a horror movie. The exclusive was something that she worked out in conversation with Douglas Haskell, who was the editor of Forum. There's these great letters where they go back and forth. And he says, we're going to try something new where, we want to be the only ones to publish something, or at least the first to publish something. So what I say to anybody now who wants to get published is you have to guard your exclusive with your life. And the way that a project comes into the world is through photography and through language. And so I would advise architects to really invest in good photography. I know so many great architects who they want to save a little money. They have a friend who does photography and they cannot publish their work.
Right.
So one is you get somebody like Mike Kelly or Joe Fletcher or Alan Tansey or Douglas Friedman and you just pay them their very reasonable rate and you let them do their thing. You get out of their way. That's the other really important thing is architects do not see images editorially. One thing that Aline was incredibly good at was convincing Eero to have an editorial approach. So there's a great example. Time magazine did a cover story about him, and they have this scene where they're sitting at the breakfast table, and he looks at a grapefruit, and he says, oh, this is, the parabola of the grapefruit has inspired some project. So Aline completely created that scene because she had an editorial mindset. She had a narrative mindset. So one, photography. Two, being really open to somebody else coming in and giving you a narrative, right? Because architects, their narrative is often like, what did the client need? What was the brief? What were some of the constraints? What was the value engineering? That doesn't make a good story, right? I had one client who did this incredible project, was really excited about the gray water recycling system.
Sexy.
Wanted to open with that.
Yeah.
And there was also this beautiful tree on the site that the whole house had been sort of designed around, and he would go to this tree and he would commune with it. And I was like, that's your story. You open with like, you go to this tree, it reminds you of something, blah, blah, blah.
And he asked tree,
exactly.
Do I exist?
Exactly. Full circle. So photography, editorial narrative intervention, and guarding, again, just really, really protecting, the images. So you get the photography, everybody wants to share them, everybody wants to put them on Instagram, but until the project is published, you just have to keep it to yourself, and you need patience for that. The other thing that Aline, I think, really counseled Eero to have was patience. He was like, I need to be dean at Yale. I need to be all these places. I need all this fame. And she was just like, it's going to take a minute. I always tell my clients, it's going to take a minute. It's going to feel like nothing is happening for 6 months. You're going to be sending me these checks and you're going to be like, what is going on? But in 2 years, you will be in a different place than you were before. I can't guarantee that, but that's been my experience, is within 2 or 3 years, your firm is in a different place. And then for publicists who want to break in, I would say it's helpful to be nice. It's helpful to be really precise and clear and direct. I had to really learn. It's very compelling to start to consider yourself a masterful manipulator, because you are constantly thinking, okay, well, who am I going to send this project to? And when should I take them to dinner so that they're happy with me? So it's like, and that can be very compelling to people with manipulative tendencies, which I certainly count myself as.
German philosophers, I would think, would talk about this at great length.
Totally. So I should read my parents' books, but I can't bring myself to.
I think Nietzsche comes to mind a little bit.
Yes, Machiavelli, perhaps. So I think as a publicist, what I wish I had known and what I think Aline wished she had known was that there is a way to kind of do it honestly. And I write about this in the book, right? Where I sort of catch myself writing emails to writers that are very similar to the emails that publicists wrote to me. So I say, your story was so good. I love this thing that you did. I love this part. Your take was so smart. The architect really enjoyed meeting with you. Are you open to another project? And I had to sort of realize that, you can do that and actually really mean it. And I did mean it every time I wrote it. And I realized probably the publicists who were writing to me really did mean it. But I think there's a way to do it where your role as the publicist is to kind of be as neutral as possible. And this is what I try to do. I sort of position myself now that I've learned some lessons as kind of like a neutral go-between. So I have the project, the writer wants the project, I'm going to give the writer the thing that they want. Another way to do it is if you ever have seen like a Hollywood publicist, right? So they're sort of favor trading and manipulating and intimidating, and there's lots of deals being made. I think that's a way to do it. But I think that way is emotionally very exhausting and very stressful. I feel better about my life when I basically treat my job as though I'm a robot. So I just think, okay, I'm a robot. What have I been tasked to do? My task is to deliver images that have not yet been published to magazines. Okay, I'm going to do that in the best way possible, like beep boop. And if I start thinking okay, well, let me think 25 steps ahead and let me take this person to coffee so that in 9 months, which is sort of how I did it the first time, I didn't feel good when I was doing that. I felt like I was manipulating people. So now I just think, okay, I have this project. Do you want it? And I'll take you to dinner.
Yeah.
Because I like you. But,
So to be fair, you're doing the same things but feeling less guilty.
Basically.
Okay. Just so we're having a philosophical discussion here.
It's a little less overt now,
right.
I think.
Right.
Maybe by now it's so fully ingrained I don't notice that I'm doing it. I'm just doing it.
There's no angst or
there's
Schadenfreude or any other German words we can come up with
Exactly. Here. Yeah, and also, I think it's very easy in this business to feel a sense of scarcity and a sense of competitiveness. And I certainly, magazines have a limited number of pages. There is scarcity in a sense, but there's also this huge proliferation of online publications. There's amazing new publications like the New York Review of Architecture. I've sort of seen everybody actually gets their moment in the sun, you know? And so I think that helps me relax a little bit. And also knowing that one publication isn't going to make or break a practice, I think is another really important thing for architects to know, is that I've seen architects get obsessed with getting a record house or getting on the cover of wallpaper. And I just try to say I think the fantasy is that they'll get a record house and the next day Jeff Bezos calls and says, can you design? And I'm like, that's just not. It's not how it works.
Yeah, the Museum of Modern Art says, we have this grassy space we'd like you to fill, please.
Exactly. Right. So it's really understanding that the value, I sort of say that the value of PR is confirmation, right? So it's people almost always get projects through word of mouth or, competitions. And so I say it's unlikely that somebody is going to read Dwell and cold call you. It's much more likely that somebody's going to ask around for some referrals and they'll Google you and then they'll say, oh, you were in Dwell. Oh, that's great. So it sort of is an extra layer, but it's not the be all end all.
I think it's important that people understand what the expectations are because they're either kind of, 0 or 60, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And they learn through working with the publicist that there's variations in between, depending on how fast you press the accelerator.
Exactly.
In your Volkswagen, since we're doing Germany.
Right, since this is a German-themed podcast, which is great. I grew up in Germany. I feel very connected to it.
And you're fluent, right? Pretty close?
Yeah, if I spent 6 months there, I'd be fluent.
Okay.
Yeah, so right now I sound my accent is apparently very good, but my vocabulary, I left when I was 6, so I have a 6-year-old vocabulary, so I can talk about going swimming and ice cream and cake and taking a nap and being hungry and how I slept, but, I can't talk about the situation in Ukraine, for example.
Okay.
But I think if I were there for a while, I'd become fluent.
What's going to happen with your publicity for your book? Who's managing that?
Great question. So my team and I had a publicity meeting, and at one point, my editor stopped and said, I just want to point out that we're having a publicity meeting to discuss Eva's book about publicity. The amazing team at Princeton University Press is handling it. My publicist there is Jody Price. She is just on top of it. My editor, Michelle Comey, is amazing. So there's a great publicity team, and I'm also doing a lot of publicity for it, so I'm reaching out to my friends and I'm tweeting and just sort of trying to get as much attention as possible. And that seems so far we're here, so something
Well,
is
I have
working.
a recommendation for you.
I will take
You
it.
might want to consider hiring a publicist so it's out of your head, because you're really a little too close to it,
So I hear that. And I considered doing that, and I interviewed a publicist who I like very much, but I realized that what she wanted was a very reasonable rate, but it was kind of hard, given that I know how the sausage is made.
Right.
I was like, this is exactly what I would charge, but I could do this. And Princeton has such a great team. I think some publishers just have no idea what to do with publicity. And, before my first meeting, I sort of reserved the right to myself to maybe hire somebody. But once I met with them, I was like, oh, they're great. They know what they're doing. So, I have essentially hired a publicist. I just don't have to pay for them because they work for my press.
I see. Okay.
But yes, outsourcing, very smart. I hired a friend of mine, Katie Hughes, who just started a company called Kazemi Consulting. She worked for the Ford Foundation, because I was like, I need help talking about what I do, because I think my career seems incoherent and nonsensical, and nobody can really figure out what I do. And when people ask me what I do, I say that I just shitpost on Twitter and sell lamps, which is not helping my brand.
Right.
And so we did
Someone needs to talk to you about that.
Yeah, she was like, So I did this great kind of like intake questionnaire, and we did a 2-hour call, and she was like, this is what you do. And she made a really great observation, which is that I wrote 2 kind of coffee table architecture books that had a little bit about sort of my take on architecture. And then I wrote this memoir about almost dying and how nice my friends were to me. And then I have this book. And I was saying, these are just so diffuse, and I can't find the link. And her point was like, I have a very particular lens and vantage point, and I use different types of media to explore that lens and vantage point, but really I'm fundamentally interested in kind of the same thing. So, my book on the Saarinens, to me, felt at first like a departure, but it's not. It's actually, I'm interested in intimacy. I'm interested in the relationship between work and life. I'm interested in how people organize themselves. I'm very interested in epistolary self-fashioning, So Aline and Eero, they write these letters to themselves.
Siri, define epistolary for our audience.
Epistolary as writing letters.
Okay.
Yeah, letter writing.
Good.
So, I'm interested in autobiography. I'm interested in all these things that I explored in my...
I didn't know if it was an Oscars thing, like Will Smith got epistolary at Chris Rock.
I think that's a good vernacular usage. We can run it by Merriam-Webster and see if they accept it for 2023.
Right.
So my interests are actually very consistent, and then I just sort of pick up different tools. So the tool for this book was like scholarly research, making a scholarly argument. It's important to note, like, this book was peer reviewed. It went through this sort of very rigorous editorial process. Like, it really had to work as kind of a work of cultural history that was convincing. I had to, convince my, at times, skeptical readers. But it also is kind of just like a rollicking story about 2 people who loved each other and tried to sort of figure it out. And a sort of juicy account of my time working as a publicist for anonymous people. But to your earlier point, even though I do this for a living, I can look at an architecture firm, and within 2 hours I can say, these are your talking points, this is your identity, this is what you say, this is what you don't say. Nobody can do it for themselves. That's another thing, is you can't do it for yourself.
You really can't.
You cannot. And so many architects are trained, through no fault of their own, but are trained in school to see language and narrative as something that is easy and that is just sort of additive, that the real value is in the drawing and the building, and that the building should speak for itself. And my whole career is devoted to this idea that buildings cannot speak for themselves, images cannot speak for themselves. And the architect is honestly the last person who knows what the building is saying.
Because that only is true within the priesthood of the architecture profession.
Right.
For everybody else, you have the 99% of the population.
Exactly.
The words are very important.
Exactly. Yeah, so always outsource, which is why, again, I outsourced to Princeton University Press.
Okay.
They're great.
Thank
They're
God
doing
for
amazing.
Princeton.
Exactly.
The book is When Eero Met His Match, Aline Louchheim Saarinen and the Making of an Architect. Thanks, Eva.
Oh, thank you, George.
That was George with author Eva Hagberg. Every now and then, we stumble across a guest that just amazes. And this conversation, prompted by a chance mention of her at the recent AIA Chicago event, turned out pretty well. Here's George's voyage back in time to the period 1953 to 1961 with Ruth Clements Pudists.
You know, I think the best way I could tell you about my experience with Eero, my husband, he received a letter, a note really, a very long rambling note from an architect whom he had directed at the Yamasaki firm for some time. And after his retirement, this fellow had visited the Cranbrook Academy of Art and had seen a booklet about the Saarinen reunion, which happened in 1995. I don't know if you were aware of that.
No.
But this architect's name was Pat Doyle, and he wrote a long rambling letter to my husband Mike about his experience working with so many people from the Saarinen office and how they regaled them with stories of their experiences. So he wanted to know from Mike and me what our experiences were. So I wrote him the following note, and if you'd like to hear it, I'll read it to you.
Sure.
Okay, I said, this is dated January 30, 2007. Dear Pat, the Saarinen reunion at Cranbrook was great. We old coots, quotes, had a ball reliving the glories of our youth. I feel very fortunate to have been a small part of the Saarinen saga, 1954-61. Those were exciting times. Eero practiced architecture as an art. Everything seemed possible. The world beat a path to our door. Our roof leaked when it rained, so we set out buckets to catch the drips. No air conditioning, etc. Fabulous commissions kept coming in. The staff, parentheses, all underpaid and overworked, in parentheses, was like a small United Nations. The guys always on charrette, night, weekends, whatever it took. International competitions, parties afterward to celebrate, the gin and scotch flowed freely. Somehow the guys always managed jackets and ties and their best manners. Kevin Roach, John Dinkaloo, Cesar Pelli, Tony Lumsden, Mo Allen, Glenn Paulson, Tom Lucas, and so many more really great guys. Visitors from everywhere, the Rockefellers, Frank Lloyd Wright, Hugh and Hans Knoll, Charlie and Ray Eames, Harry Bertoya, Dan Kiley, Alexander Calder, Erwin Miller, and on and on and on. I came to Saarinen from, quote, Mahogany Row, unquote, at Pontiac Motors, unaware of so many things, and my horizon expanded. The whole world became my oyster. Without a doubt, my life was totally changed and enriched by the Saarinen experience. How sad that Eero died so young. Who knows what more he would have accomplished. I moved to Hamden, Connecticut for 6 months to help organize the office. It was so difficult and sad for everyone. I have nothing but admiration for Kevin and John. They did their best, but it never was the same without Eero. An era had passed with him. Oh, well, enough of my ramblings. I really enjoyed your letter, and I'm glad to share my Saarinen experience with you. Best wishes, Ruth P.
Wow, Ruth, that's amazing.
Well, it was amazing. I mean, those were really fabulous years. We didn't realize it at the time, but it was awesome.
So you started in 54, and how did you hear about working at Eero's office?
Well, I answered an ad in the Pontiac Press. I had been at Pontiac Motors for 5 years, and I wanted to make a change. So I answered the ad, and I went over to their office on a Saturday morning. I was wearing high heels. I'm not very tall and always wore high heels. And they used a grating as steps up to their office building. and I caught my heel in the grating. I remember that well. The door was locked, so I waited a while, and eventually Olaf Hammerstrom arrived and unlocked the door, and we went inside. And pretty soon Mr. Lacey, the money man of the firm, came. And so he interviewed me briefly, and we discussed my financial expectations, which really didn't concur with his. But anyway, I waited, and Eero eventually came in, and he showed me into his office and asked me if I thought I could create a bit of order, and I looked around. And there were wads of vellum paper all over the floor, and a large black leather portfolio on the desk, and a calendar. And I proceeded to go through the contents of the black folder and discovered that one of the letters in there waiting to be replied to was a year old. And that letter happened to be from John Buchan, who was asking Eero to be a juror for the selection of the Australian Opera House. And so I took everything out of the portfolio and organized it to what I thought would be the most beneficial way of handling it. And I proceeded to pick up all the wadded up stuff on the floor, and I pressed them all out. And in case he might want to refer to it, looked at them again and see if there was anything he wished to keep. And pretty soon he came back and he said, "Have you seen my glasses?" And I said, "They're on your head." And he explained to me that he had 3 pair, one for near, one for far, and one to wear while he was looking for all the others.
That's great.
I really didn't know anything about architecture, and I was not impressed with him at all, okay? So he asked me why I had organized things that I had, and I said, well, I note that there's a letter here that's a year old, and I would strongly suggest that you answer that one first. And he said, all right, let's do that. And so he proceeded to dictate to me a reply. So I transcribed his dictation, and it was 3 pages long.
Was this in shorthand?
Yeah, sure.
That is now like an ancient language. No one does shorthand anymore.
Well, it's too bad. I did 250 words a minute, okay?
Wow.
So I was good. I was very good. Best in my class. Anyway, I condensed his 3 pages of ramblings into a 1-page letter that said everything he wished to say in a very nice way. And he evidently was quite impressed. So he went in to Joe Lacey, and they had a conversation. And Mr. Lacey explained my financial requirements and, more than they were offering, etc. And Eero said, hire her. And that's how I came to work for Eero.
Now, at what point did you realize that you were in somewhere very special?
I don't know.
Because, in the beginning, this is just another job, right? I mean, you're just going into another office. But at some point, it must have clicked in that this was a really unusual place.
Well, it was a really unusual place because I had come from Mahogany Row at Pontiac Motors, and I dealt with them all, okay? And I was really not impressed with their setup there at all. Can you imagine the leaking roof and no air conditioning?
Right.
So his president secretary, she stayed on a week to kind of give me ropes on what to do and what have you, and introduce me, and I met the people. And as I said, it was like a small United Nations. There were people there from everywhere. Most of them were very, very nice. It was a challenge, actually, because I worked not only for Eero, but there were 40 people in the office at the time I went there. And there were 2 women in the office. I was the second one. And I was not only his secretary. The first girl, she acted as a receptionist and handled the payroll and Mr. Lacey's needs. And I sort of did everything else, including the Secretary Eero, okay?
Right.
I mean, this is opening the mail and having the coffee served, the whole thing. It was really quite informal. And Eero explained to me as I was going out the door after our interview, he said, I really want you to understand we don't have time here for all the superficial niceties. I was dressed in a Navy gabardine business suit with appropriate, I thought, office attire, and people were coming in shorts. It was strange, okay?
Ruth, for somebody telling a story about the 1950s, your memory and accuracy is amazing.
It is? Well,
Yes.
I'm going to be 91 on Thursday.
After you got caught up with all the mail, what kind of things were you doing in the office?
Whatever was needed. You see, handling the mail, I became very familiar with every project that was going on. And I knew who was the project director, who was doing whatever, with whichever. So it was very good for me to really learn the works of the office. And Eero, he always referred to me as the little general.
That's great.
Whenever he would leave on an extended trip, he'd say, well, little general, take well care of everyone. You know, English was his second language. So he didn't say take good care of everyone. He would say take well care of everyone. I did the hotel reservations, all the air reservations, whatever.
What were some of the key moments in the office? For example, did people really celebrate when they got a new commission, or did they celebrate more when something was finished?
They celebrated everything. They celebrated getting the commission. They celebrated when it was finished. We had some wonderful parties.
Did you get to travel much out of town with the company?
No, I did no travel with the company. I stayed absolutely at home.
And this went on until Saarinen's passing.
Yes. He died on September 1, and he was buried on September 8. And the firm relocated to Hamden, Connecticut in October. And it was just unbelievable. It
was very sudden, wasn't it, his passing?
Oh, it was extremely sudden. He had tremendous headaches. But Eero he worked harder than anyone I've ever known. He worked night and day, and he worked holidays and Sundays and Saturdays and whenever. Architecture was his life. It truly was. He was a very hard-working man. And I'm sure he probably had headaches, and he wouldn't give in to them. And he went to U of M, and they diagnosed him. He had cancer of the frontal lobe, and was to have surgery. And I think Eero thought he was going to beat it, but he didn't.
And he was just 51.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why did the firm move to Hamden, Ruth? Why that town?
Well, I'd like to say that the firm moved to Hamden so that the office would be closer with all their associates, and they wouldn't have to do so much travel. But the truth of the matter was that Aline Saarinen wanted to get back to New York, okay? So that's why the office moved to Connecticut.
Okay. And then it was Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo that took over running the office?
Well, it was Kevin Roche and Sean Dinkeloo and Joe Lacey. Joe Lacey was the money man.
Okay.
And on the day of Eero's funeral, I went in that day. It was a Saturday. They were having a private funeral. And the only people who attended were myself, Joe Lacey, John Dinkeloo, and Kevin Roche, and Eero's mother and his sister, and Aline, and a friend of hers from New York.
And what about Eric and Susan?
They were not there.
They were not there, okay.
And I don't know why. Aline wanted to send out a press release, which I typed up that day. She's a really strong woman to be able to write a press release, and on the day of her husband's funeral, you know. We had a teletype in our office, which I operated as well. So I sent this out by teletype. You want me to read it to you?
Sure.
Okay, it says, press release, Eero Saarinen Associates, September 8, 1961, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Eero Saarinen's plans to move his architectural office to Hamden, Connecticut from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan will be carried out according to schedule. It was announced today by his partners, Josephine Lacey and John G. Dinkeloo. These plans were initiated by Mr. Saarinen a little over a year ago. Around October 15, the major part of the staff of Eero Saarinen and Associates will be installed in their new quarters at 20 Davis Street, Hamden, Connecticut. These consist of a remodeled 1906 crenellated mansion of orange brick with white limestone trim on a 3-acre site at the edge of Lake Whitney. 10 jobs of major significance designed by Eero Saarinen are now in various stages of construction, working drawings or final design detail, said Mr. Lacey. The entire staff is dedicated to the completion of these buildings according to Eero's designs. We are also dedicated to continuing the practice of architecture according to the high standards of integrity and idealism, which he said. We all believe that if we allowed his untimely and sudden death to disrupt the plans in which we were in such enthusiastic agreement, we would be doing him an act of disrespect. We are gratified, Mr. Lacey continued, that each of the clients has expressed his faith and belief in the disciplines and teamwork of our office and is equally dedicated to carrying the jobs through to successful conclusions. The last designs which Mr. Saarinen completed before the onset of his illness and sudden death from a malignant brain tumor were for a 37-story skyscraper at 53rd Street and Avenue of the Americas in New York City for the Columbia Broadcasting System. He was especially excited about this design, said Mr. Dinkaloo. He felt he was going back to the tradition of Louis Sullivan and making a step forward from that dramatic and optimistic moment in the design of tall buildings. Jobs now under construction include the terminal for the Transworld Airlines at New York International Airport, scheduled for completion in early '62. 2 residential colleges at Yale University, scheduled completion next summer. The new Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C., in association with the engineering firms of Amon and Whitney and Burns and McDonnell, to be completed in July '62. New laboratories for Bell Telephone Laboratories, Inc. at Holmdel, New Jersey, to be completed this fall. Administrative headquarters for Deere and Company in Moline, Illinois, scheduled for completion in July '63. And the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis, scheduled for completion in April '64. Projects in the planning stage designed by Eero Saarinen before his death include the Repertory Theater for Lincoln Center in New York City, in which Joel Melziner is collaborating designer, the Columbia Broadcasting System headquarters building, the new terminal building for the International Airport in Athens, Greece, in association with Amon and Whitney, and the North Christian Church in Columbus, Indiana. Mr. Saarinen, showing symptoms of illness on August 14, was taken to the University Hospital, Ann Arbor, Michigan on August 21. He died there on September 1 after a 2-hour operation. Eero Saarinen and Associates, succeeding Saarinen and Associates, was formed in 1950. The original office was located in Bloomfield Hills, where Eliel Saarinen, Eero Saarinen's renowned Finnish father, received the commission to do a Cranbrook Academy. The decision to move to the east was motivated by the concentration in that area of consultants with whom the architects worked in close collaboration.
Wow, Ruth, I feel like I'm time traveling now, like I'm hearing this for the first time in 1961. That was astonishing.
She wrote out this on the day of her husband's funeral, and I typed it and sent it out.
On the teletype?
Yep. I got a teletype in my office.
So this was the sound that we used to hear in the old movies in the background. Whenever they would talk about the news, you'd hear the little teletype sound effect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing I wanted to mention about that letter to John Buchan in Australia about the Sydney Opera House. Eero explained to him that his time was so limited that the only way he could serve on that jury was if he could combine it with a trip that he had planned to Indonesia. And he didn't mention it to Mr. Buchan, but that trip to Indonesia was with President Sukarno. And Sukarno was interested in having him carve a new capital city out of the jungles, much like Niemeyer had done in Brazil.
In Brazil, yes,
right.
Sure.
That was quite an interesting trip. I know Aline and Eero were talking about being on elephants and going to Angkor Wat and all kinds of stuff. I guess Sukarno was quite a guy. But anyway, they were very late in arriving back in Sydney to serve on that jury. When Eero got there, they had more or less made up their mind who the winner would be, and it was not Bjorn Utzon.
Yes.
Eero convinced them that they should choose him and that could become the symbol of the country. It did, didn't it?
It was absolutely right.
Right, absolutely.
After this transition, you stayed with architecture and you worked with a Yamazaki firm.
Well, I came back to Michigan and they heard I was in town, and in the architecture world here, everybody knew everybody else. So I went there as their office manager, but I didn't plan to stay very long because I wanted to relocate to California. So I thought I would, for a short time, stay there. But so I went there as their office manager, and it worked out quite well. And then after a while, Yama's secretary left, and he wanted me to be his secretary as well. And so I did that as well. And I had a staff of 12, and I had managed the office and ran it the way Yama wanted it run.
And what year was this?
I was with Yama from May of 62 through, I think, November of 68. I married and was expecting my one and only child. And I wanted to retire and raise my baby myself. So I gave it all up, and I was with Yama 6 years.
So you were around when he got the World Trade Center commission?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you something interesting about that. The day he got that letter from Austin Tobin, who was the director of the Port Authority, he asked his secretary, Judy, to have all the associates, bring all of his associates into the office to inform them of this, momentous letter. We were there serving drinks, what have you, and Yama looked at me and he called me Ruthie. Nobody ever called me Ruthie except Yama. He said, Ruthie, I want you to know, if Eero had lived, he would have received this commission. And I thought, wow. He didn't need to say that, but he did.
Yeah.
Yama was very aware of other people's needs. He was a good guy.
All the accounts of him that I've read say the same thing. Very well respected, very considerate.
He was a good guy. And Eero was too. They both were. Awesome.
When you were working in Yama's office, how was that different from the Saarinen office?
Oh, very different. I don't know really how to articulate it. You see, we had an engineering section as well. At the time I went there, before Yama built his own office building, they were not very large either. Before the World Trade Center, we were on the second floor of the building. Most of all the design and working drawing staff. And then we had an engineering group who were in the lower level of the building. And it was quite different having engineers as well as architects. Although they both were like United Nations, it was quite different. In Yama's office, they were from the Philippines, they were from Japan, they were from Korea. They were from many places, from Turkey, from everywhere, really. But it was quite different because Yama and Eero's styles were different. It was really a good experience in both places, really. I was very lucky.
When you retired from Yamazaki's office to raise your child, did you get recruited by other firms that wanted you to come work with them?
No, I didn't. I tried to raise my daughter, and I learned how to cook, and I learned how to weave, and I learned how to garden, and do things that I hadn't done before. It was a whole new kind of life. And my husband traveled a great deal, so I had quite a bit on my plate.
And he was working with Yamazaki's firm still?
He was a principal in the Yamazaki firm, yes.
Okay.
He traveled the world.
So he was working on the Trade Center and all the other projects that were going on?
Right, and much of his work was in Saudi Arabia and Spain. He didn't do a lot on the Trade Center, but some.
Yamazaki died in 1986, and what happened to the firm after that?
My husband was a part of the firm that carried on. They did well, and then they fell on hard times, and then my husband and the older people had transferred their interest to another bunch of people, and it didn't turn out well.
Oh, okay.
And that's what happened with that firm.
That was, I think, in 2016 or so, the firm was restarted?
After the original group left, he purchased the name
I had read that many of Yamazaki's early records got destroyed in a fire at some point.
I don't know about that. I know much of the material was given to the state in the state archives.
Is your husband still practicing?
No, my husband is retired.
He's retired.
And he does what amuses him. At the moment, he's designing a villa for our daughter in the south of France. That is if she wins the lottery.
Very nice.
She plans to win the lottery. I've named it the Taj. We're having fun with that.
Given your connection with architecture, and certainly your husband's, what kind of house did you end up living in?
Well, in 1967, we decided to build our own home. And we have lived in it for the last 53 years. And we have a modern house, I guess you'd call it. It's sort of a treetops house. I went out to California and fell in love with those cliffhanger houses around Big Sur, and so we found a lot with a 50-foot drop and lots of trees and rocks and stuff. And my husband designed us a house, and as I say, we've been here for 53 years.
Ruth, this has just been one of the most thrilling interviews I've ever done. I just feel like I'm living the history with you.
Well, as I say, I can't believe it myself, but I'll be 91 next week. Well, this week on Thursday. I'm glad I still have a memory.
Your memory is astounding. I mean, the level of detail, you're remembering what clothing you wore at your interview is just mind-blowing.
Well, that was hilarious because everyone was walking in shorts and carrying umbrellas. It looks really weird. Big black umbrellas, wearing shorts. And here I am in this navy blue suit with high heels and looking appropriate for a business office. Well, a mahogany office. And then to be able to have a grating as a step to go into the office was something else. Eero had designed that office building on a cocktail napkin on the flight back from New York. It's still there, that building.
Ruth, thanks so much for talking with me.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by Modernist realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Guest researchers Carrie Cesarino and Kelly Policelli are at the beach, roasting the kitties in the sun, toasting with the dads on the veranda, and loving the fact that remote work is here to stay.
Oh, yeah.
U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I will be back soon with another Travel Back in Architectural Time edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
We'll have some more of that goat cheese, please.
Let's go back to the future.